have a wonderful speaker, I assume, given what I've seen in his PowerPoint presentation. This should be really fascinating, and I don't have much more to say about it than that. So, Professor Fernbach, please take the microphone, put it in front of you, and with that, Professor Fernbach, and a round of applause for him putting all this work into this presentation.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about my book, The Knowledge Illusion. I wanted to start, so I'm going to just tell you when to change the slide.
Yes.
So go to the first slide. I have to admit to being a total non-expert on libertarian philosophy. Most of what I know about libertarianism comes from having attended a conference at the Cato Institute last summer in Washington, D.C. And my work is very much about ignorance, how little we know. At least that's a major part of it. And two of the other attendees at the conference were Brian Kaplan and Ilya Somin. Do you guys know these folks? Both libertarian scholars. And they both wrote these excellent books. One of them, The Myth of the Rational Voter by Kaplan, and Democracy and Political Ignorance by Somin. Both really interesting books. Covering some of the same ground that we cover from sort of a different perspective. And what I found particularly interesting, their books are both about how little voters know. And both of them take that and they go to the conclusion that that implies that we should have small government, and basically speaking to libertarian philosophy. What I found interesting and kind of a little hard to square is that if I talk to my liberal friends, they'll quote the same information that voters don't know very much and take it in the exactly opposite direction. Mm-hmm. Voters don't know very much, therefore they need help, and we need to have more paternalism in our government. So this is, for me, like the big puzzle of this is that you can take the same basis of facts, which basically says, as human beings, as individuals, we just don't know very much. And I'll give you guys a lot of the psychology and the cognitive science behind that today. Where does that lead you in terms of a philosophy? I have to admit myself to being a little bit more of a believer in libertarian paternalism. I believe that people do need help to make good decisions, and that the government has some role in that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I'm certainly very open-minded about this kind of stuff. I'm not ideological at all about these kind of things. But anyway, I just wanted to start with that to say that,
Would it be premature? I guess the premise there is that voters know very little, so somehow magically somebody who gets elected knows more.
Right.
And I suspect that's not shown. So from my libertarian perspective, hate speech, the cure for hate speech is more speech. The cure for ignorance is education and free dialogue,
right.
Not taking somebody's claim that they somehow know more as if it's true.
I think that's good. So
So
I think that's a good statement of sort of the position of both of these guys, and I think it's a reasonable position. So I just want to keep it in the back of our minds as we're going through the discussion. So you mentioned education, and a lot of what this is about is going to be about the way the mind works fundamentally, and what that implies about what we can realistically expect of individuals. And so I'm definitely interested to hear your guys' thoughts as we go along. I think we can go to the next slide. So those books are both about ignorance. People don't know very much. Voters don't know very much. It's a little hard to see these slides, huh?
Yeah, I apologize.
Okay, so I want to tell you guys about the starting point for the book. The starting point for the book was some puzzling data from psychology. That's a toilet. I don't know if you guys can see it too well. It's sort of like an annotated plumbing diagram. I know this is kind of a strange place to start, but bear with me for a second here. This was research that was done by a psychologist named Frank Kyle at Yale in the 1990s. He was interested in understanding what do we know about the way that ordinary everyday objects work, like this toilet, okay? And so you can kind of do the experiment on yourself as we sit here, all right? So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, I'm going to ask you to tell me, without thinking too hard about it, how well do you understand how a toilet works? Okay? Just don't think too hard about it. Give me your basic sense. Okay, that's what Kyle did. And what people tend to say is that they have a pretty decent sense. They know something about it. They have a decent idea of how a toilet works. Okay? But now here's the trick. Now I'm going to ask you to explain to me exactly how it works, going step by step and giving me all the details. So if you go to the next slide, this is what happens. No, this is what happens when you do that. Okay? So basically what happens is people reach inside and they realize that they have almost nothing to say. Okay? We know remarkably little about the way. Our initial impression is that we do understand in some depth. Okay?
May I
Yeah.
ask a question?
Sure.
How many people here have installed the toilet? So this is not a typical group.
Okay, that's true. I've installed one too. I still couldn't give you a very good explanation of how it works.
Really?
I can describe physics of it.
And for the first time in my life, I attempted to change a flapper,
Uh-huh.
and I succeeded.
Hey!
I think even okay. So that's the basic idea of the knowledge illusion, is that we overestimate the extent to which we understand the world. We don't know very much. So you take those books I showed you earlier about ignorance. We don't know very much. It's true. There's an additional layer, which is that we're really bad at assessing how much we know. And so if you think you do know how a toilet works, let me give you another example here. Let's go to the next one. Okay. Great study. So this is a correct schematic of a bicycle. This is Boulder. I assume everybody in this room loves to ride their bicycle. There's a great paper in 2006 from Rebecca Lawson, a psychologist, and she gave people a very easy task, okay? So she gave them a drawing kind of like this, but it was missing some of the parts. It was missing the chain and parts of the frame and so on. And she gave them an easy task. She just said, okay, just draw on those parts for me. We all ride bikes all the time, right? This should be pretty easy. So if you click forward here, you'll see some of the attempts of the various subjects in the experiment. Keep clicking. You can't really see them too well because of the projector. Keep going. 2 more clicks. But basically, the outcome is, and these are not cherry picked. This is like everybody. This is a really hard task for people. People have no idea where the parts of a bicycle are. And maybe you guys are better at this particular task. It's possible. But in general, people struggle mightily with this kind of thing. Okay, despite the fact that we all ride bikes all the time. So. Go forward to the next slide. What I really liked about this one was a few months ago, there was an Italian artist who independently discovered this effect when he realized that his friends couldn't draw a bicycle despite the fact that they bike around all the time. He turned it into an art installation. So if you go forward, he had them try to draw bikes. Go forward to the next slide. And he made artwork out of their attempts, very similar to what Lawson found in her experiments. And then go forward one more. And then he actually built the bikes. It's crazy what I say. It's a pretty clever thing. Yeah. So this was the starting point of the book for us. Yeah.
The point is, this bike would not work.
No, that bike would not work. The parts are all in the wrong place. MC Escher might want to ride that bike. Okay, it's a very puzzling effect, right? Like, we know very little about the way the world works. I'll talk about that in a second, why that is. But in addition, we also tend to dramatically overestimate the extent to which we understand. So if you go to the next slide. I want to show you a couple more examples. So what do we know? That's sort of like man-made stuff. If you want real complexity, go to nature. nature is extremely complex, and we all learn about this stuff in school, but the amount we know about the natural world is dramatically tiny as well. So there's some great studies looking at, after people have taken courses, looking a little bit out into the future, what do they actually retain about the inner workings of various physical natural phenomena. So if you click forward here, go back. Oh no, you can't see the drawing at all.
No, I'm sorry. You can see it on this screen, but it's
Anyway,
washed out.
this is what a heart looks like. People learn all about it. If you ask people to try to draw a heart, you get basically like the toilet thing. People know almost nothing. Another great example, go forward here. This is the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle, which is like the energy source of all living things. It's how our cells generate energy. It's pretty important. We all learned about it in high school, even if you don't remember. This is just, if you click forward again, this is this is what happens. This is what they actually retain a couple years later. The best thing about this is that this is the citric acid cycle, so he helpfully drew a lemon here because it's citric. But the thing is, human mind is just not made to store a lot of detailed information. I'll talk about why in a second. But let's click forward again. So one reaction that people have when they see this kind of stuff, and they look at our current political environment, where there's a lot of shocking kind of ignorance going on, and people are very concerned about it, is to say, well, oh man, like in the olden days, people were so much smarter, and kids these days, right? It's actually not true at all. This level of ignorance has always been the case. So it's true that 25% of Americans don't know that the Earth revolves around the sun. It's a pretty shocking statistic, but click forward here. And in 1943, nobody knew that Abraham Lincoln was president during the Civil War. This is not at all a new phenomenon. It stems from fundamental aspects of the way that the mind works. It's not something that is new to like today's society. Now, in terms of like extremity and polarization, those things have increased, and there's reasons for that. But it's not because the fundamental way that we think has increased, has changed. I make that argument pretty strongly. Yeah.
Thank you. You've just explained to me something that's been puzzling me, is why there's so many YouTube videos about the Earth being flat. Thank you. Got it now.
I love the example of flat earthers because, and I talked about this, I gave a TEDx talk down in Denver over the summer, and I use this as my motivating example because it's an amazing example. And it actually turned out that the day of my TEDx talk, the front page of the Denver Post was about the local chapter of the Flat Earth Society in Colorado trying to buy a billboard. So it actually turns out that groups of people can come to believe just about anything. And I actually wrote this New York Times piece on exactly why that is, which you guys should check out if you're interested in. It's called Why We Believe Obvious Untruths. But the kind of stuff we're doing in this book speaks exactly to how that's possible. It seems very hard to understand how it's possible. Normally, what we do is we think, oh, those people are idiots. Those people are stupid. And I actually think that that's the wrong way of thinking about the problem. It's overly simplistic, and it doesn't do justice to the sort of nuance and the interesting aspects of the underlying psychology, which I'll get into in a second here. So let's click forward here. Okay. Starting point for a whole book. Why am I talking to you guys? Like, why should you care? Not because this isn't about toilets and about bikes and stuff like that. It actually ends up being relevant to all of the most important issues that we grapple with. This is a cute example, but I like it a lot. I do a lot of research on people's opposition to genetically modified foods, which I find to be a really fascinating topic. It's a counter-scientific consensus. There's a lot of counter-scientific consensus beliefs there, and there's puzzles about why that is, and so on. So let's go back to the slide, and this is a study that was done a few years ago at Oklahoma State University. It's kind of a cute study. They first asked people about their attitude about labeling of GM foods. Okay. And people had a pretty strong opinion about it. They said we should label the GM foods, and 80% of the people supported that. But then they asked another question, so click through. And they asked people whether there should be labels on food with DNA in them. And people were perfectly happy to agree with that as well, which is pretty crazy. And so,
Second question.
and so when I see this, I'm not that surprised, because in our studies, people are perfectly happy to express, I'm sorry, in our studies, people know almost nothing about genetic engineering. You go and survey the general populace, and people know very, very little. That's consistent with all the stuff I showed you already. And yet they're perfectly happy to voice very strong opinions about it.
And fracking too.
Yeah, and fracking is another good example. Absolutely. All of these complex scientific topics, we have really strong opinions about it, but we don't know anything about them, which was kind of one of the fundamental puzzles that really generated my interest in this.
We have a gentleman.
Hi, thank you for the talk.
Speak up. Okay, Ken.
Thank you for the talk. In the American Revolution, many voices in Europe said they'll never make it without a king.
Yeah.
So let's take it as a given that populations are mostly ignorant of most everything. We
Yeah.
deal with two ways of solving that. One, you limit it to an elite and they know what's going
Yes.
on. The other is the American system, which allows people to try stuff. And if you're good at farming, you get to be a successful farmer. If you're bad at farming, you go work for somebody else. And so I think these are key things in politics. Given that American people do not know what makes things work, is not likely to change anytime soon. However, the free market system does a better job of allocating back to people who know and specialize and do it right. And the European nobility system is another way, and it works less well.
Right. I think that's a pretty nice statement of the libertarian perspective on where you would go from this data. I don't want to get yet into that. Like I said at the beginning, I'm no expert on the libertarian philosophy and political philosophy in general. I think that these are very thorny. Actually, I was a philosophy major of all things in college, so I know that these issues are extremely thorny, and I don't think there's any. What I like to do in these kind of things is I would love to hear from you guys so I can understand your perspective better. So it's very helpful to hear that.
Final statement.
Yeah.
Flint, Michigan ended up with bad water.
Yes.
They're still blaming, who did this to us, and it was all the government. Had they had competing water supplies, one would have
Right.
gone out of business, somebody else would have rushed in, and it would have much more smoothly gotten to the correct answer.
That might be true. So let's.
I'd really like to listen to the professor's presentation.
Yeah. So like I don't have too much to say like that you guys don't already know on that kind of stuff. But let's continue and see if it spurs more ideas there. So let's keep moving forward here. Okay, so a few years ago, we ran a series of studies where we wanted to test whether people's political attitudes were to some extent based on this knowledge illusion. And so what we did was we did sort of the equivalent of this toilet experiment, but with the important political issues of the day. And what we found over and over again was this knowledge illusion. So people started off with pretty strong opinions about these kind of issues. And then we asked them to try to explain. And what happened was exactly what happens when people try to explain the toilet. People realize that they don't understand as well as they thought they did, and they actually back off those strong positions a little bit. So it actually reduces the extremity of their positions a little bit. I'm going to show you guys one study in particular, which I think is kind of interesting. So again, some of the details not showing up here, but I'll just explain the study to you. So we asked people about their position on some of those issues I just showed you. And then this is one condition where we ask people just to list reasons why they believe what they do. Okay? Why are you in favor of cap and trade or whatever it is? And then we asked them whether they wanted to donate to an advocacy group that advocates for their position. What you see on the y-axis here is the likelihood of donation. And when we ask people to generate reasons, the data look exactly like what you would expect. The more extreme they were to begin with, the more likely they were to donate. Okay? That's what the data are showing.
So what's the next thing?
That's how extreme they were in their position.
Oh.
So the guys on the far right side are guys or gals who said, I'm very strongly in favor of that. I definitely want to donate after generating reasons to a group that advocates in favor of my position. Okay? Click again. Now we found something very different when instead of asking for reasons, we ask people to try to explain how the policy works mechanistically. Okay? Now we get a very different behavior. Now extremity no longer predicts whether they're likely to donate. So what happened is this. The people who were initially extreme tried to explain and failed, and they realized that they didn't know what they were talking about. They backed off their strong positions a little bit, and they were no longer so likely to donate. Now notice, when they just listed reasons, that didn't happen. It's just too easy to come up with reasons for our position without doing that deeper reflective thinking to appreciate the gaps in our understanding. So this kind of explanation is a pretty important kind of component on this. What this shows is that really our political attitudes are like everything else. We just don't know very much at all, and yet we feel like we understand. And that gives rise to positions that are more extreme than is really justified by how much we know. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. All right.
I think we all know everything here.
Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to take a step back, and what I want to try to do is give you guys a sense of the argument we make about the kind of thing that the mind is, the kind of thinking that we engage in, and how the mind works. And what the goal, one of the main goals of the book, is to really change your perspective on this, because I think most people have the wrong understanding of the way the mind works that gives rise to sort of misunderstandings of the way things should be. And one way to illustrate that is by thinking about this phenomenon I just showed you. One reaction that people sometimes have when they see this is kind of exasperation or embarrassment. How can we be so ignorant? How can we know so little? And then to go to your idea, which is we have to educate people. They have to learn. They have to become expert in these topics if they want to voice an opinion. I actually think that that's not quite right. And yeah, why it doesn't work. So I'm going to show you why it doesn't work. So there was a great study by this guy, Thomas Landauer, a psychologist in the 1980s. Basically, he set out to estimate the size of an individual's knowledge base in bytes. So the same scale you'd use to measure a computer. Okay? This was in the 80s when people really liked to compare the brain to a computer. And he did this in a variety of different ways, but one of the ways he did it was he would analyze memory experiments. So in these experiments, you're given some pictures or words or bits of music. You study them, and then you get tested later to see if you can recall what you studied. Okay?
I'll call you back.
Now, using that data, what I can do is I can estimate the rate at which you can learn information and also the rate at which you forget. And then he just took it and he extrapolated out to 70-year lifespan. He just added it all up to get to how much we actually know. It's a pretty clever method. Okay? So let's go to so anybody have any guesses or anyone know the answer?
What's the question again?
How much is your knowledge base in bytes?
Oh, in bytes.
Like,
Sure, I'll go for a
Point
terabyte.
zero
That's
zero
a
zero
nice big
zero
number.
something.
okay, go to the next slide and we'll see the answer. Okay, the answer is 1 gigabyte.
Good job, Bill.
I was under by 1,000.
Yeah, 1,000. Yeah.
No, you overestimated by 1,000.
You're off.
Right.
Correct.
This is, I find this to be a mind-blowing result. Now, is his number exactly right? Probably not, but to an order of magnitude, I think it's probably correct. And, you can fit 64 gigs on a little thumb drive. This is an amazing result, I think. The mind is just not made to store a lot of detailed information. Now, if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. Everything is dramatically complex. I think I have another slide just showing this in a second. Yeah. The world is dramatically complex. Okay, just a couple dumb examples here. This is a super simple object, a ballpoint pen. To really understand a ballpoint pen, beyond just like, if I asked you guys, you could all maybe come up with a very schematic, rough explanation, maybe not, of how it works. But to really understand it, there's so much to know. There's probably not a human being on earth who really understands a ballpoint pen. That's a ballpoint pen. You know, you start getting a little more, this is just a refrigerator. It's got like thousands of parts in it. And now get into natural stuff. Think about the healthcare system, you know, that we all want to have really strong opinions about. The world is so complicated. And I'm always struck by this. Whenever I feel like I've become an expert in some little tiny narrow slice of something, I learn that I didn't understand it really. And there's more depth there and more complication. So as human beings, as individuals, if we tried to really understand the world and all its complexity, we would inevitably fail. There's just way too much to know. And so it would be an exercise in futility for the brain to try to store huge amounts of detailed information. So that's not what we do. So let's go to the next slide. The second big idea in the book, so the first big idea is this knowledge illusion, that we overestimate how much we understand. The next big idea in the book really gets to how it's possible that we can thrive as human beings despite the fact. And that gets to the subtitle of the book, which is Why We Never Think Alone. And the big idea here is that human beings are not designed to be individual thinkers. So let's go to the next slide. Let me see. Is that the video that I have? Okay, yeah, this is the video. Okay, let me set this up for a second. Human beings are not made for individual thinking, okay? It turns out that what really sets us apart from all other thinking animals is our ability to collaborate with other people in shared cognitive pursuits, okay? What we're very specialized at doing that no other animals can do is the ability to share knowledge and coordinate our behavior. So what that allows us to do is to have networks of people, communities, where everybody has their own little bit of expertise, but our minds are designed to put everything together, to be able to share. Okay? Yep.
Honeybees are a counterexample. You said no
Okay.
other animals.
Hold
can
that
do
thought for a second.
So
We're going to get to that.
I'd like
Or
to-
ants.
Okay.
There's other herd animals, more pack herd animals.
Okay, so
Anyway.
I'm not going to get into details. It's not the same thing, okay? I will say there's a great analogy, and actually have a beehive picture in a second, and I'll talk about the analogy. But it's only an analogy, okay? And I'll tell you why in a second. But let's first show the video. Okay, so this is a video that comes from work by a psychologist named Michael Tomasello, who studies human children and other animals like chimpanzees, and tries to figure out what's really special about the kids. What is it that they pick up really fast and are expert at that other animals cannot master? So just as an example, let's watch this video, okay?
Oh. Oh.
So this little kid, he's like less than 2 years old, he immediately reads the experimenter's mind and figures out how to coordinate his behavior to achieve the goal. Okay?
Lovely.
Cute, right? Super cute. And then he even makes eye contact at the end because they're really, they have. So we look at something like that, and as human beings, we just say, oh, that's nothing. It's so easy. But it's actually incredibly difficult cognitively to design a system like that because it involves a huge amount of cognition. So that little kid has to understand that the experimenter has mental states and that he wants to open the cabinet, and that's a desire he has. He has to understand what knowledge the experimenter has, what his capabilities are, etc., and how to coordinate his own behavior to be able to achieve the goal. It's really hard. So it looks easy because we're human beings and it's what we specialize at. But it turns out that no other animals can come close to human beings on this kind of cooperative, collaborative behavior. So let's go forward another slide here. And I think this is going to be your beehive picture. No, okay, so I want to make another point first, which is I showed you guys like the most basic version of this kind of collaborative thinking. But what this allows us to do is pursue incredibly complex goals, despite each one of us having that 1 gigabyte, like knowing next to nothing. And so a great example, I love this example. This is a beautiful building. This is the Milan Cathedral. And the construction on this was begun in the 14th century, in 1386. And then the facade was completed under Napoleon in the 1800s, which I think is just amazing. Like the amount of time that goes by. It actually turns out that there's a punch list for these kind of things. Like if you did a home renovation, you'd have a punch list. They completed the punch list in the 1960s. So this thing was finished in the 1960s. That's like 600 years. And there were 75 different chief architects involved in the project over that time.
How many?
75 over the 600 years. So what you have is a pursuit of incredible complexity where no one individual involved knew 1/1000th of what would be needed to build this building. And yet somehow we're able to take all of that knowledge that we individually have and all these specialized abilities that we have and put it together and be able to do this. This is really the secret to humanity's success. It's this collaborative thinking ability. So let's go forward one more slide. And here's your picture. This is a beehive. The reason I show this is because it's an analogy to what bees do. So in a beehive, you very rightly point out that you get an emergent complex behavior, despite having a lot of specialization. So there's no like queen bee. There's a queen bee, but she's not in charge of everything. She just does her own little job, right? There's no one in charge, and yet the complexity emerges by each of the individuals doing their own little piece. Yep.
Are you familiar with the book Honeybee Democracy?
No, I don't know it.
Would you like to borrow it?
Sure. Yeah, I
Okay.
should read it. I should know it. Yeah. Anyway, it's an emergent complexity. Bees and other kind of animals that have this emergent complexity, they engage in very simple kind of communicative and pattern matching kind of cognition. They don't do anything like what human beings are doing when they read other people's minds and all that kind of stuff. That takes a whole special set of cognitive abilities that other lower animals don't have. But analogically, it's a good analogy, I think. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay, so that's all like the really positive side of this stuff. When you think about us being ignorant as individuals, it's really in the service of being able to form these communities where we can pursue amazing, complex goals. So it's really the secret to our success. So it's not at all something we should be embarrassed about. It's really part and parcel of who we are as human beings. So that's the kind of the positive spin on it. Now, the negative part, or the dark side of participating in these communities of knowledge, is that by virtue of participating in a community of knowledge, it makes us kind of feel like we know a lot more than we do. We talk about a contagious sense of understanding. So when you are in your community and everyone's saying, like, I feel this way about healthcare, the healthcare bill, it gives you a sense that you yourself understand. But what you're really not doing is reflecting knowledge that exists in your head. Unless you're a super expert, you know very little about the healthcare policy. It's just impossible. It's a very complicated thing. As lay people, we can only know a little bit. And so when we express those opinions, what we really are doing typically is channeling our community of knowledge. And I just want to show you quickly this one study by my co-author on the book, Steve Sloman. Go back to the previous one. He ran these studies on contagious sense of understanding. And basically, it's kind of a cute thing, but basically he described these new scientific phenomena. We've since done similar things with public policy issues, but he described these scientific findings. And then he just had two conditions. He either said, the scientists know how this stuff works, or the scientists don't have any clue how it works. And then he asked people, how well do you understand how it works? So in this case, it's some glowing rocks. And people are asked, how well do you understand the glowing rocks? And the result is that if people know that other people understand, they feel like they understand a little bit better. That's what's shown on the next slide, which I don't think you can see. It's the result. You can't really see the data here, but that's basically the result. Just by virtue of knowing that other people have the information, we feel like we understand. And so the idea is that we are built to so seamlessly share knowledge in our community that it makes us feel like we understand a lot more than we do because the information is out there. Let's go to the next slide. This has also been shown with some really cool work using the internet. And so Google is the ultimate community of knowledge. You guys can go and Google anything you want. And I mean, we just have access to huge amounts of knowledge at our fingertips. And it turns out that just having access to Google, searching the internet, makes us feel smarter. It makes us feel like we know more than we do. So this was some work that was done by a guy named Adrian Ward. He used to be at CU. He's at Texas now. And basically, here's the setup of the study. He asked people some quiz questions, and then he allows them either, across conditions, to either Google the answers or not. Okay? And then he gives them a separate test where they're not going to have Google. And it's going to be a whole separate, different set of questions. And the people who are allowed to Google, they both feel better, they feel smarter, like they know more, and they think they're going to do better on the test. So it's like having access to the knowledge makes us feel more knowledgeable. Okay, so let's go forward. Okay, so now this is going to bring us all the way back to policy, which is, I assume, what you guys are most interested in, and the issues I talked about at the very beginning.
Sorry, my mistake.
When we express our opinions, our political opinions, we're not expressing knowledge that exists in our head. Right? That's what I said before, right? What we're really doing is channeling our community. We're reflecting knowledge that's out there. And we do it so naturally that we just often don't even realize we're doing it. And that's, I think, the root of the knowledge illusion. And I think it's the root of a lot of the extremity in our discourse. Right? When we talk across the aisle and we say, oh, how can you believe that? You're crazy. Like, it's so obvious that what I believe is correct. A lot of that is because we're overestimating how well we actually understand the issue. And so let's go on to the next slide. And okay, so yeah, that's basically the argument that I made in this op-ed that we published a few months ago in the Times, why we believe obvious untruths. It's this dynamic of individuals not really having the knowledge to be able to adjudicate what's true and what's false. And yet, we don't realize it because of this knowledge illusion. We feel like we understand much more than we do. Let's move forward, and we're getting to the end of the discussion. So, where we're going with this right now is really about trying to improve the tenor of discourse. How can we actually, given this dynamic, how can we actually have more productive discourse around issues, around complex issues? Now, you guys might see this and think, like Phil is advocating that nobody should take positions on anything, and that's not at all the claim. There's 2 points. One is we should be better calibrated in our extremity of our positions. What that means is that if you don't understand something in any depth, it's okay to take a position on it, but you shouldn't have a super strong, extreme position that you would, use to beat an opponent with. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is, it all comes down in the end, and I think this gets to some of the points you were making before. It all comes down in the end, thank you, to being able to identify the right sources of expertise in our community and having an ethos of challenging the sort of status quo in terms of what people believe. So it's not that we shouldn't take positions, we have to take positions. And it's also not the case that we should become expert on every topic. That's impossible. But what we have to be able to do is identify the right sources of expertise so we can have a good chance of actually being in the right on a lot of these issues. So let's go back and I'll just give you guys a couple. Yeah. So I just want to finish with a previous slide.
Oh, you want to go back to the previous slide? Okay.
So I want to
Explain whether they advocate.
the next slide. So I want to stay there. Yeah.
Okay.
Right here. Okay. I'm gonna finish with this. So I want to end on like some positive kind of ideas from our research about how we can actually improve the tenor of discourse. Now I will preface this by saying that there's no silver bullet here. There's no easy answer to these questions. This stuff stems from very basic aspects of the way the mind works. Okay, so it's not like there's a silver bullet here. However, there are some things that we have learned from our research that can help. The first thing, and I talked about this before, is I showed you guys this study before. When we advocate, when we generate reasons, really reflecting and realizing the gaps in our understanding. By comparison, when we try to explain it forces us into grappling with the complexity of an issue. It reveals complexity. And so, not for now, thanks. Okay. Should I pause for a couple minutes, or?
That's up to you. We have, the way it works for those who are new here.
Let's make sure you finished your sentence. Practice intellectual humility.
Okay,
Is that what you
let
want
me
to
take
say?
2 more minutes,
Yeah.
and then we'll continue. Okay. So discourse that focuses on explanation rather than advocacy tends to be open minds more, and it tends to leads to more common ground. Okay. The second thing comes from work that we're doing now that I won't tell you guys about in detail, but it's new research that we're working on, which has to do with how we frame issues. Often you can frame an issue in one of two ways. In terms of a fundamental value, that is, I think this is fundamentally right or wrong, or in terms of consequences that will arise if we actually implement the policy. Those are two very different ways of thinking about framing issues, and we can often frame one and the same issue in both ways. We often encourage people to talk about their values, but what we find in the research is that when you frame an issue in terms of values, what it does is, and it can have the effect of making the differences between the two sides look very extreme, and it makes the issue seem very black and white, and it makes people feel like they understand the issue very deeply. If we actually instead ask people, if we frame an issue around consequences, it has a similar effect to what we see with explanation, which is that it reveals that things are more complex than they seem at first blush. And it can have the effect of making people realize that actually the people on the other side are not horrible, and they don't have totally different values than you, and the issue is complex. And in fact, it might be that a lot of the disagreement is just apparent disagreement that has to do with the way that we talk about the issue, just talking in slogans. And finally, the last idea is sort of the most general, which is about intellectual humility. And is about the idea of habitually checking our understanding. So I think it's very easy to recognize when someone who disagrees with you does not have a firm grasp of the issue. That's very easy for us to see. It's very hard for us to recognize that limitation when it's our own limitation. We have a hard time realizing it. Because of this knowledge illusion, and it's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's just part and parcel of the way the mind works. To this illusion. And so the way to break that is to get into the habit of checking our understanding around issues. And I've gotten much better at this myself. Whenever I feel myself wanting to, express a strong opinion on an issue, I'll stop myself and say, wait a second, like, have you actually thought deeply about this before? And often I find, well, actually I don't understand this issue that well. I'm going to back off, kind of listen a little bit more, and maybe go and do some more research. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to, go to the other side, but it means that I'm going to be a little bit better calibrated in how I talk about the issue. And for me, I think that is really an important ingredient for productive discourse. So I'll stop there and just point you guys to the book, which is, if you guys are interested in these ideas and you want a lot more detail and stuff, definitely, check out the book. I think. You guys
Okay, we have Dan.
Okay, so I'll stop there, and I guess.
Yeah, and please raise your hand. I believe it was Dan, then Scott, then gentleman over there.
Do you want to have Q&A on the microphone here?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
People
It's part
can,
of
if
the
they
video?
speak up.
Okay, I'm gonna answer questions. I want to be on YouTube showing down.
It won't bother anybody.
Okay, so Dan first.
He's worrying about posterity.
Yeah, I think you're still going to
Nobody looks at
record.
the site. You should stay in case more questions come.
No, it's good. Can we? Do you need to have the Q&A on the video? Or?
I would prefer it.
Okay.
If you wouldn't mind, it makes for a more complete presentation.
Okay.
So, Dan, Scott, then this gentleman over there.
Okay. Who's going?
Dan Doyle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I really appreciate the research that you presented because it's a different level of what
Yeah.
I'm familiar with. Some of the things you didn't mention, we have like 12 or 14 cognitive we make frequently.
Mhm.
And one of the most common ones is called the confirmation bias.
Right.
where we tend to select information that supports what we already believe is
Yes.
true. And then we argue, well, I've got these other facts that support what is
Right.
true. And so then we have these horrible discourses with people where it's really, I'm trying to use force and call you
Yes.
names and whatever to make you agree with me so that I can feel better, because my ego might suffer if I'm not totally knowledgeable.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a few different things
Yeah.
to say. Well, I probably could answer that question for an hour. Okay. So I'm going to try to be brief here and say that confirmation bias is like a huge barrier, definitely, to like people revising their beliefs in the right way. What I think is unique about what we're saying here is that we're giving sort of a different lens. So like when people in the field talk about overconfidence, which is a major issue, and it stems a lot from confirmation bias. We think we're very confident about our beliefs because we tend to neglect information that's counter to our beliefs, and we tend to readily accept information that's consistent with our beliefs. That's called the biased assimilation of evidence. What we're claiming is that there's another dimension of overconfidence, which stems also from our failure not to weight information that we know incorrectly, but to fail to take into account stuff we don't know. So it's like a separate dimension of it. And both things definitely contribute to the kinds of effects that I talked about. If you want to learn more about this, so our book was reviewed in the New Yorker alongside another book, which is a book about reasoning. It's called The Enigma of Reason. And it's a pretty cool book. Basically, the argument that they make in that book is an evolutionary argument that the purpose of reason is actually not to get to the truth, which is kind of counterintuitive. But what they claim is that what the purpose of reason is, the reason it evolved, was so that we could convince other people of our positions and advocate for our positions and get them over to our side, because there's a lot of sort of evolutionary benefit in being able to marshal people to your position. And so if you want sort of a deep take on that confirmation bias approach, it's good. But I think the two ideas are complementary. So all of these things contribute to why it's so darn hard to change people's minds. And another thing you said, which is like what doesn't work, is just beating people over the head with, you're wrong, here's some more information, you're thinking about this the right way, I'm so smart. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think confirmation bias and the knowledge illusion are both major contributors to that.
We wrap our identity around our beliefs.
Oh, totally. So the identity thing is a major part of this, right? Like when we give a position on something, we're not reflecting our knowledge, we're reflecting our identity as a community member. And so that's a super important part of it, yeah. Okay, I think.
Great. Scott.
Who was next? Oh, Scott was next.
Related to that,
Val?
the ultimate knowledge or wisdom is the ability to know what you don't know.
Yes, I totally
And the
agree.
second is to be able to admit it.
Yes.
Okay, that really is the key to wisdom, I think.
Absolutely.
Another book related to the one mentioned that is very important in terms of what we're getting at with sharing or decentralized decision-making is called The Starfish and the Spider,
Okay.
The Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations.
Oh, nice. Okay.
By Ori Brock.
Great.
And finally, the libertarian position, at least as I see it, is acknowledging that people believe all kinds of things,
Yeah.
including stupid things and things, dangerous things, and so on. But the libertarian position is you should be able to believe whatever you want to believe, as long as you don't force your beliefs on somebody else.
Right.
That's really the key. It's not me trying to convince you that you're wrong. It's you believe what you want, just don't force your beliefs on me. That,
Right.
to me, is the libertarian position.
Yeah, that's nicely stated. Yeah, this recognition of what you don't know as a marker of wisdom is a really important idea. We have a chapter in the book on trying to redefine the concept of what it means to be intelligent, because intelligence is usually defined in terms of individual mental horsepower, but we kind of think that's the wrong way of thinking about it. And so a major important component of it is having this kind of intellectual humility, and also, yeah, being able to admit it. I think it's super important. It's very hard, because I think the reason it's hard to admit is because society at large has the wrong view of the mind. We think of the mind as being this individual information processing thing, and that therefore we should know everything and we should be expert in everything. And so a lot of people, I mean, a lot of our lives we go through kind of pretending we know what's going on, pretending we understand
It's also
stuff.
the authoritarian idea
Yeah.
that if I don't know, somebody else does.
Right.
And so I follow somebody that I think knows
Right.
what the answer is. And very few people are willing to say, nobody knows, or
Right.
there is no authority.
Yeah,
on
I mean,
this, or I'm my own
right.
authority.
I will say that I do think personally that respect for expertise is a really important. It shouldn't be blind respect for expertise, but respect for true expertise is a really important ingredient of a community that's like a healthy community, because people do develop expertise, and they are the ones who can actually help us to get to the right kind of positions. If as a community we don't have that healthy respect, or as different communities we respect different sources of expertise, that's where we can get into major trouble, because now all of a sudden people, kind of different groups, can believe completely different things, and it can be fairly divorced from what's truly correct. So
We have
do we have-
Minchie.
oh, here this way first.
Thank you, Scott. I agree with what you were saying. Kenneth Boulding was an economics professor here, died in 1993. He wrote in the 1950s a book called The Image. That was where ideas transfer as viruses in logical math, and
Right.
sure that 20 years later Richard Dawkins put the name meme on
Right.
that, and of course the rest was all stolen from Boulding. Boulding went on to serve as president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, quite an honor for an economist.
Yeah.
And he talked about the falsifiability being the cornerstone of it,
Right.
from Karl Popper, and that the humility of intellect you refer to is actually institutionally built into science. It doesn't matter if you're the janitor or the pope, it matters what your evidence says.
Right.
And the key thing about knowledge, I think, is that communication is only possible among equals. And nobility that I mentioned didn't work as well as the American free-for-all. And that even today we have education in the hands of experts, and medicine in the hands of experts, and religion. All of these things are status defined who gets to speak the truth. And of course the media is totally filled with bozos, and Congress and all of those other status defined communication things. So if we get away from that, go with a small L libertarian society, we'll have much more truth as tested against reality rather than tribal affiliation.
Well, let me push you a little bit. So it's what you're saying sounds good to me, but the devil's in the details when it comes to defining truth. So how do you, as an individual, if I go out and I try to figure out what's the truth around the global warming debate, well, I guess there's no debate there, but let's take a more contentious issue.
Depends on what side of it you're on. We can then
Yeah.
go on.
There is
Okay.
no truth.
Okay, I didn't mean to step on toes there. Okay, let's not go into that one. But no, my point would be,
No, it's a good-
given how little I know, I'm actually not really in a position to adjudicate that. There's no way I could spend days and days reading scientific papers. I would not get to the correct assessment, and everything's probabilistic and complex and all this kind of stuff. So at some point, we have to be able to defer to expertise in terms of what to believe. And so it can't be a total free-for-all, right?
Okay, yes, it can, and out of the free-for-all, order comes based on tangible reality. The science has no idea what the weather in 2050 will be. And so those who are claiming it are doing it in the name of religion. You need to feel guilty about exhaling, and therefore I control
Well, okay.
you.
So we're I feel like we're wading into like some territory that's going to be contentious. I don't think there's any need for it, like any need to go there. I'm no global warming expert. I'm no GMO expert, etc. What I can speak to is like the underlying psychology. I'm happy to go there. And what I would say is that I firmly believe that in order to adjudicate these issues about what's true in scientific debate, it can't be a free-for-all. There's no way that individuals can kind of suss that out. You need to have some strong structures in place to be able to adjudicate truth there. Otherwise, everything is just totally uncertain.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Dan.
Sorry, I was just.
Yeah, but that's my personal belief, and that, you know, like I said, I'm a very open-minded person. I'm not ideological about this kind of stuff.
You're much closer to being able to adjudicate it. You start with where does the money go? 2,000 times as much money goes for the statist position as for the free market position.
Yeah, I don't believe that that's going to be a very good way of adjudicating the scientific truth. Like, I would rather rely on like well-designed experiments and people who can properly evaluate them,
No,
which is
what
an
I'm saying
expense.
is the well-defined experiments get trampled by the rush for money. The money corrupts the science. If you go with true science, they would first of all be humble and not make predictions about you have to do this in order to save the planet. That is all nonsense driven by political status accumulations rather than by the free-for-all that would come from a libertarian role.
Yeah, so look, I don't have the expertise to speak on that, so I think it's probably best to.
Okay. Whoa! I think that's that humility.
No, this is what my uncle at dinner, and how do I, you know, like what do I do? How do I convince him? And I say, if you're not an expert in the topic, like your job should not be able to try to convince somebody to come join your side. You might be able to open their mind a little bit to say there's actually more validity to my position than you might think. So you're like, you shouldn't be so sure about your position. You should go do some more research. But I don't feel comfortable trying to argue about the reality of these kind of really complex scientific topics. I do firmly believe that it's really important to have expertise to draw on in these kind of debates. But that's
How
my
do you
personal
determine
issue.
that? How do you determine that?
Well, I think you want to get in first.
One second. 1 second.
He has a list.
It's
Oh.
the list is me, Mike, Frank. Anybody else wish to speak? Okay, then I will speak for a moment. Please compare your work with the work of Wisdom of Crowds.
I think that there's we talk about that in the book in more detail. So like the simple answer, I guess, is that there's a synergy there because we talk about how if you think about the context in which we talk about Wisdom of the Crowds is the development of information technology and the rise of artificial intelligence and so on. And what we talk about in the book is the idea that true superintelligence, worried about like a really smart computer getting too smart and then sort of taking over the world. We kind of think that's overblown. But what the internet is allowing us to do is to marshal the wisdom of the crowds, essentially, to have to sort of crowdsource opinion and forecasting and so on, to be able to take advantage of this sort of community of knowledge in a way that's very productive. And that's very consistent with our idea that knowledge resides in our networks, not in individuals' heads. Is that a reasonable answer to the question?
Yes, and then I'll come back at the end of the list after Mike and Frank speak.
I just came from Lake Wobegon, and I know that I have more than 1 gigabyte of knowledge.
Good. You're above average.
The fact that Joe works means that we do have certain cultural touch points. However, at the limits of my knowledge, I remember reading someplace that that the political landscape now is more polarized than it's been at any time
That's
since right about the Civil War thereabouts. Why do you believe that's happening now?
It's like there's a combination of sort of sociological factors that has to do with both sort of stuff on the political side in terms of incentives for polarization, gerrymandering, that kind of stuff. Again, not my area of expertise. Another area that we've talked more about is, which is probably maybe top of mind for you guys, is the kind of filter bubbles that we exist in now. And so I'm a marketing professor, so I can say this, but I find it kind of scary that our news is now being targeted in the way that traditional marketing is being targeted. And so what that means is that because we're getting our news through this kind of in this targeted way,
It's the
we get the
internet's
stuff
fault.
that we like to read, and related to confirmation bias and things like that, people like to read stuff that's consistent with their opinions.
Yeah.
And so what you have is more and more information being filtered in that way,
Yep.
and a sort of breakdown of trust in media institutions and authority,
Okay.
where different groups believe different sources of authority. And so that is a thing that I think really accelerates it in a major way. Plus, when people have their dialogue online, it's like the equivalent of road rage, where they behave in ways that would never happen if you were face to face with someone. And then we get this caricature of other people that is almost never reality. It's true that some people on the extremes can have very extreme kind of beliefs, and they can be very, very immune to truth and reality and all that kind of stuff. But I actually, from talking to a lot of people, believe that's a major minority. However, those people's voices get amplified in our society. So we kind of, sitting on one side of the aisle, we assume everyone on the other side of the aisle is like that. You have face-to-face conversations with people. You avoid talking about the sort of contentious stuff about like how are my values different from yours, and you talk about what do we actually want this policy to achieve. A lot of the times, people are not that far apart, and so these face-to-face kind of conversations, I think, can be more pleasant.
Yeah, I've done marketing statistic tea leaf reading myself, so yes, I know how
You've
we-
what? Sir?
I've looked, for example, at Google AdWords
Yeah.
data myself to decide which ads are succeeding, and
Right.
that's how I understand all about the filter bubble and internet, how statistically now we can target much more carefully
Yes.
than ever before, and therefore it creates a greater possibility of the polarization. So that makes
The
sense.
scary thing is when our information comes in that way, as
Yeah.
opposed to product recommendations or whatever it is.
Yeah.
This is the entire field of marketing is basically
Yes.
aimed at trying to figure out how you can, target people in a way that's more efficient. And so I don't see that changing. So there might be certain things that you can do around the margins, but we're going to have to learn how to make things work despite that reality.
I was going to say it's the internet's fault, but you're telling me it's actually marketing data analysis' fault. That
Yeah, that's the.
Well, it's data analytics, which is kind of where
Yes.
marketing is going. I teach data analytics now, sort of like
Okay.
all marketing has gone to digital marketing
yeah,
data
exactly.
analytics.
Right. Okay.
It's
Okay. Thank you.
totally,
That's
yeah.
helpful.
Okay, it's Frank.
A comment just on the phrase paradigm shift.
Uh-huh.
But, I mean, in a sense, I would think that the illusion of knowledge is the individual stepping back and having a paradigm shift. Is this sort of the same concepts? Maybe? Or,
Okay, so articulate what you're asking a little bit more.
Well, for me, the example is, does the sun rise in the morning?
Yeah.
And the truth is, no, it doesn't. The horizon drops.
Yeah.
But you need to take a paradigm shift to correct your illusion of knowledge.
Yeah, I would definitely like to think that that's what we accomplished in the book. That's basically the idea. Now, this is not us like coming up with a radically different view of the mind. We're reviewing our stuff, our research, but also a lot of other research that's come out of cognitive science from more of a perspective of what's called embodied cognition or situated cognition, distributed cognition, which sees the mind differently than the classic sort of computer metaphor of the mind. I think that most people in Western society have this sort of computer metaphor of the mind, which leads them to sort of some of those incorrect conclusions. It makes some of these really crazy results I talked about make no sense if you have the wrong metaphor, if you have the wrong model. So in that sense, yes, like one of the major goals is to change your perspective, to think of the mind and of thinking as more of this social process than it is this individual process. And I think it does have major implications for some of the. Is that what you're
Yes.
asking?
Okay, it's going to be Heidi, Dan, then Ralph. Heidi, you're up.
That guy mentioned cognitive biases,
Uh-huh.
like confirmation bias.
There's
There's a Wikipedia page about cognitive biases, and
yeah.
there's like at least 100. Scott
yeah.
Adams, the creator of Dilbert, he
Yeah.
just strongly recommends that people get familiar with these because he thinks that like 95% of the time we're actually irrational.
Yeah, so
Not rational.
I guess my take on that is, it's not so useful for me to think about like this long list of biases. That's kind of what people in my field did for a very long time. But like what I like to think about are the deeper, fundamental, underlying things that give rise to multiple kind of irrational behaviors. And the other thing about irrationality is that there's sort of two takes on it. One take is this idea that, well, people are kind of idiots. And a lot of the field has sort of thought that way. And you look at the fact that we fight wars and build nuclear weapons and all this kind of stuff, and you look at, oh my God. The other side of it is, like, you see what this little 2-year-old child was capable of doing. We can't program a computer to do anything like remotely close to that. And so when you take people and put them into their environment, they're incredibly, incredibly good at being adaptable and flexible and successful at certain kind of tasks. They can be incredibly irrational in certain kind of contexts because of that. So it's like it depends on the context that you put people in terms of whether their behavior is going to be adaptive or non-adaptive. So I think it's wrong to think of idiots and being like so error-prone and irrational, but it's really important to understand our underlying limitations because we are imperfect. We do not process information in rational ways all the time. We do make mistakes all the time. We do believe things that are incorrect. And so I think there's definitely like a middle ground. You have economists assuming that people are basically rational and markets are going to sort everything out because of that. And then you have people in my field, judgment and decision making, who basically say like people are completely helpless. There's some middle ground, which is human beings are really amazing machines in certain ways in terms of our ability to do stuff. Like what I talked about is a perfect example of this, I think. On the one hand, our ignorance and our community sharing of knowledge is our greatest strength. It also leads to people believing the earth is flat. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
The next person is Dan, then Ralph. I need to stop this recording for 30 seconds. Okay, so we're resuming. The next person is Dan, but before we do that, I'm going to ask again, please contribute to our guests' lunch if you have not done so already. Dan, you are up.
I just want to join with what you're saying. Human beings are the most successful species on the planet at this point in history. And we've done that by becoming the supreme predator. And we're a pack animal. And we predate in packs or groups of people. And so we don't live in isolation. We can't. We don't do well. And so it's our ability to predate and communicate and work in cooperative manner that has allowed us to become this parasitic species on the face of the earth. We're also parasites on each other, and we predate on each other. I don't know if there's a rational way to get out of that, where we don't.
I don't think we want to get out of that.
Yeah,
I think
we
that's
have to look at it and go, yeah, this is.
You think about like a
this is who we
beehive,
are.
right? The complexity emerges not at the level of the individual, but at the level of the group.
Right.
And so, in order for us to, build particle accelerators or whatever the next great feat is that we're going to do, it really requires this ability. It's what makes us so amazing.
Absolutely.
And the other thing about it is, I think about this all the time. It's like you guys, if you don't come from academia, you think of like the academic life as being sort of like you're in your office thinking deep thoughts and like brilliance emerges or non-brilliance or whatever it is. That's not how it happens at all. I have a student come in and we just talk, and ideas emerge from the interaction in a way that I don't think I could do sitting there on my own, and my student certainly couldn't do sitting on his or her own. And it's not a matter of one of us having the idea. It's somehow in that interaction magic happens.
Which requires
Right.
focus.
Yeah, that's right.
Scott, I'll let you go in front of me. Go ahead.
The key to human success to me is the ability to learn from experience,
Mhm.
not know something or not follow the leader. It's the ability. That's how decentralized decision making works. It's learning from trial and error, mistakes, and so on. I'm a little concerned about your deference to experts and leaders. How do you know that someone is an expert
Yeah.
or someone is someone that you should believe?
Yeah.
And worse, someone that you should do what they tell you to do. Because my
Yeah.
approach is I don't consider anybody that way. I don't
Yeah.
think anybody has the truth.
So
I
yeah,
don't believe
so
anybody.
this is an extremely hard question. It's the $64,000 question. I do think that we are all victims of the knowledge illusion, right? But and sort of blindly accepting things often, and maybe not you guys, but blindly accepting things often that our community is feeding to us. But I do think that we have the wherewithal to actually evaluate expertise fairly well. Are we going to get it right all the time? No. To evaluate what's credible and so on, if we sort of step back and get ourselves out of that mode. So I don't give up completely on the idea of expertise at all. I think that, yes, we are going to get it wrong sometimes, but if we have the right kind of ethos in our community of challenging things that don't seem quite right, or saying, are we sure about this, and so on, I actually think that we can get to finding the right cues that tell us whether some evidence is credible or not. Giving up on the entire thing and just sort of giving equal deference to everybody doesn't seem right to me. Yeah.
The wisdom of the crowds does have its value. The wisdom of the crowds does have its value.
In certain contexts, so the wisdom of the crowds, like if we're voting on the weight of an ox, yes.
Yeah.
If like whether the science suggests that GMOs are safe or not, I don't think wisdom of the crowds is going to get you very far.
How much wisdom is in Antifa? Black Lives Matter.
Okay.
I know.
Okay.
We have Jerry up. You're up next. So it'll be Jerry, then Diane. Did I get your name correctly? Elaine. Okay, and then Ralph. Finally.
If you haven't already answered my question, how do we encourage any possible or clear disagreements we have among us and tackle them without closing down the debate?
So some of the things I talked about before, which is, it's like this explain rather than advocate approach. And I think also like focusing on the consequences, which is really important, because when we talk about our values and what we want and what we believe and what we morally think is correct or not, what we're doing is we're sort of injecting ourselves into a discussion of what should really be a discussion of the issue. And I think sometimes disagreements, not always, sometimes we do have fundamental disagreements about our values. I don't think we should really debate those things. I don't think debates like that go anywhere, because if you just fundamentally believe morally that something different from someone else, you're not going to convince them of anything. But a lot of the time we hide the fact that actually we're not so far apart by talking about issues in that way. And I think the other thing is you got to be curious about why the other person holds the position that they do. Try to learn and figure out whether you think there's validity there, as opposed to wanting to immediately try to tell them that they're wrong. So that's kind of the dialogue I think is fruitful, is say, okay, what is going to be the effect of that? How is that going to work exactly, and so on. And I think both sides can kind of come together and saying, well, actually, this is complicated. Maybe I didn't understand it quite as well as I thought I did. And maybe you and I aren't that far apart. The discussion might not end up in that place. But I think you have at least a better chance than the normal way we talk about these things, which is shouting at each other, which I think is relatively non-productive. And also, I don't feel comfortable at all arguing with somebody about an issue that I don't understand that deeply, which is something that we get in the habit of just because we don't reflect and realize that we don't understand it that well. And also, we go, oh man, you don't understand this issue. And by comparison, I know a lot more. But it's probably the case that relative to what could be known, both of you know very little. So.
We have Elaine, Bill, then Ralph.
I would wonder, I'm sure you've thought about it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you think, if we should, how we should, or what about voting.
That's a great question. Yeah, that came up a lot actually at
I'm
the Cato
sure,
Institute.
And so I'm wondering what kinds of
because
ideas
yeah,
have-
people were advocating for more expertise. You should get more votes, or certain people shouldn't be allowed to vote, and so on. Okay, so I guess, and actually I gave this talk at the Athens Democracy Forum 2 weeks ago, which was really stupendous, and I got to hear from people and a couple of libertarian
I would love
folks.
to see that. If
I don't
it's
know
on
if they put it
video.
online, but it was an amazing experience. It was a New York Times conference. It was really cool. Some libertarian folks came up to me and asked me precisely this, and I hadn't really ever formulated my own position on it. And the answer I gave is what I think is for me the right answer, which is that because I think that none of us can become experts on all these topics, I think it's completely unreasonable to think so. And because we all have within us the wherewithal to do what I just said, which is evaluate credibility and expertise and decide what we want the position to be, like I think one person, one vote is the way to go. Because I don't think anyone should be privileged.
You hit us hot button.
Could I just interject?
Yes.
There's happens to be alternative voting methods such
Yeah.
as approval voting, instant runoff voting, our current first past the vote.
That's a different question. That's
Okay.
separate from the question of how many votes should individuals have. Should some people not be allowed to vote? Should there be a sort of a literacy test for voting? All that kind of stuff. I don't think anybody, any layperson knows like 1/1000th on any of the issues that we deal with, and therefore, if you know 2/1000ths, I certainly don't think you should get an extra vote for that.
That's
That's
what I was
kind
talking
of
about. He's
yeah,
talking about-
but other kinds of
He's
systems for
70%
approval
white.
voting, things like that, so minority parties can get more of a say. I'm very open-minded about that kind of stuff. I've read, a bunch of interesting articles that suggest that there are approaches, and is this coming up because libertarian?
He's the approval.
I
Yeah.
happen to be the advocate for one of the advocates
Yeah,
for approval voting.
I'm very interested in that, and I certainly don't have a problem with that. It is a separate issue.
He ran
Thank-
as
thank you.
as the approval voting party.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Last November.
So-
Thank you, Ralph, and everyone for letting me jump the line there.
Okay,
back.
so
I think I have to cut it off after one more question, if that's one or two more, because I have to
Then
be.
Bill,
Mine,
then Ralph.
mine is actually very quick. It's not really a question. It was really from Jerry. Your points on the were to explain rather than advocate. Talk about consequences and practice humility.
Mhm.
And then you verbally mentioned back to Jerry, and this is the point that I'm going to take away from today, was if you're having a discussion with somebody, try to get them to explain why they believe what they believe. Because your chart showed that when somebody starts to try to explain it, their mind opens up.
A little bit, yeah.
So to get somebody to open their mind, try to get them to explain. And I'm going to try to do that.
Try it.
So thank you
And
for
tell me
bringing
how it
that
works.
today. I will.
I will be very curious to hear.
And I'm going to make 3 points. I hope I'm going to be able to do it quickly. The first thing is that we have a very homocentric, if you will, notion of what a successful species is. If we measure it by biomass, it would be either ants or wheat. The second thing is I want to point out that we had a series of discussions. We had about 7 of them, simply on the question of what is truth. And we had a series of experts present to us. Last, I want to make a comment about a question that was asked during the 1980s, during one of the gas crises, in which people were asked, did you install a thermidor in your car to increase gas mileage? And a large percentage of people said yes, where basically, a thermidor is a way of preparing lobster. So, when we ask people what they know or what they think they know, we also need to factor in the fact that people don't like to appear stupid. So they will respond to things that they know absolutely nothing about,
Yes.
hoping that they don't appear to be out of step with perhaps making their car more efficient. And with that, Professor Fernbach,
Thank you.
oh wow, that was great.
Thank you so much, and thank you for lunch. It's nice talking to you. Yeah.